Hello, my name is Aiden Wickman, and welcome to my professional development on special education's role within the school to prison pipeline. Before we jump into the topic at hand, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss some definitions of what we are going to talk about today. I'd like to set us some focuses, just so we're all on the same page. The school to prison pipeline is the first item I'd like to discuss. The American Civil Liberties Union has done much research on the school-to-prison pipeline and defined it as a disturbing national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. In other words, schools across the country are at risk of setting children up for failure before their adult life even begins. There are a few ways that schools do this, including using policing in schools, but the main focus of what I'd like to talk about today is the use of zero-tolerance discipline, which includes detention, suspension, and expulsion for incidents involving drugs and violence. Remember, right now we're just establishing definitions, we're just setting some focuses, so I will come back to this point later. But for now, let's take a turn into a very quick history of special education in the United States. 1975 saw the passing of the first act that guaranteed and enforced free and appropriate education to all children in the United States. This act eventually codified the use of the least restrictive environment for students with disabilities. The term least restrictive environment refers to a continuum of placements from general education to a completely residential education and steps between where students can be placed in order for them to get assistance to meet their needs. Again, we're just defining things here, we're just setting some focus, so keep the term least restrictive environment in mind because it will come back. Now that we've set some focuses and we got some definitions squared away, we can dive into the main topic of this presentation. And to introduce the topic, I would like to ask you to chew on two questions. One, who is affected in the school to prison pipeline? And two, who is represented in special education, or who is overrepresented in special education? Let's start with the first question. Who is affected by the school to prison pipeline and why does it matter? In studies performed across the United States secondary schools, black students lost 103 days of academic instruction per 100 students enrolled due to out-of-school suspensions. This statistic is even higher for black boys, which is 132 days lost of instruction per 100 students enrolled. For every 100 students, those black students lost 132 days of school. Compared to their white counterparts, white students lost on average 21 days of instruction per 100 students enrolled. This removal of the school community mirrors the method of a greater society, which involves removal of criminals into jails and prisons, which is the reason why I want to talk about it. That's how it affects the school to prison pipeline. But it goes without saying that students of color are overrepresented in the school to prison pipeline. Let's move on to our second question, which is enrollment in special education. So special education's goal is to assist students with disabilities. Let's bring back the spectrum of environments, the least restrictive environment. According to Ferry and Connor's research, students of color are more likely to be placed in a more restrictive special education class than is necessary for their disability. In other words, disabled students of color are more likely to be removed from the general education classroom than their white peers. Part of the reason this happens is insensitive educators, particularly white educators, who have little knowledge of black students' cultural norms and language use. This is an imbalance of knowledge, leading special education teachers to classify black students with a disability at a higher rate than their white peers. It should go without saying that the removal of these minoritized groups leads to dire consequences, including lower achievement in school and poor post-school outcomes. Now that we've answered those two questions, I'd like to shine a spotlight on the parallels between special education and the school-to-prison pipeline, which I think you'll probably pick up already, but let's shine that spotlight on them. Earlier, I talked about detention, suspension, and expulsion as it relates to the school-to-prison pipeline. These punitive measures unequally attack children of color, particularly black students, as explained earlier. And these punitive measures focus solely on the removal of students from the community of school. Because of this zero tolerance policy, these students are being taken away from their education. They are being removed from the community. It does not set them up for success. And in special education, we see a mirrored effect. The use of more restrictive environments on disabled students of color has a harmful academic and social effect on the child, which is exacerbated if the student is a disabled child of color. This removal from the community creates an othering of disabled folks from non-disabled folks in the greater society of the United States. Out of sight, out of mind. This, of course, has extremely damaging ramifications on the disabled community. Most adult Americans, then, will have no interaction with, or little interaction with visibly disabled people until their adulthood, which is well past the time that people develop social etiquette and social norms. Rebecca Taussig, a disabled author, remarked in her book, "When you grow up in a world that doesn't see you, or welcome you, or include you, or represent you, you believe the world isn't for you. It's for all the other people." So, what is to be done? There has been harm that has been done to these students. How do we change and restore this harm? To understand the harm that has happened, we must not see these two issues presented today as two separate issues that both need attacking. Instead, these two issues that are presented are symptoms of a systematic issue. They are two parts of a whole problem. Ergo, we must view our population as intersectional beings. We are not creating policy. We shouldn't create policy to attack both of these issues. We need to create policy that attacks the systemic issue. Disability critical race theory is one way researchers and theorists are attempting to do that. Disability critical race theory, or DISCRIT, is the combination of these two theories, critical disability theory and critical race theory. One of the 10 tenets of DISCRIT reads as follows. DISCRIT emphasizes multidimensional identities rather than singular notions of identity such as race, disability, social class, or gender. So there's theorists out there who are attacking this systemic problem, realizing that folks are multidimensional people. They have multidimensional identities. Tammy Ellis Robinson, PhD, is a researcher at the University of Albany, and in 2021, Dr. Ellis Robinson led a professional development for stakeholders of educational facilities, which engaged them in action research sessions, assisting these educators to develop cultural competence among special education teachers. In her words, in organizing the project, we centered our work on acknowledgement of identity and the capital we all possess to advantage our various positionalities to affect change. These professional developments are super important. They're a very helpful tool. The awareness and adoption of discrit in education is a stepping stone to enacting meaningful policy that protects disabled students of color from falling into the jaws of the school to prison pipeline. It's not just enough to talk about it. We must use these as a stepping stool to enact policy, meaningful change. Policies that must be enacted include an increase of resources for schools to offer more integrated classroom for students with and without disabilities, and to the execution of professional development across the nation in schools like Dr. Ellis Robinson's. Those professional developments will assist schools in the adoption of a more just special education system. There also must be a system of checks that ensure disabled students of color are not being overrepresented in the special education system. Those professional developments are the way to enact those policies. There has to be checks in order to make sure that our most vulnerable students are not being overrepresented in special education. They're getting the assistance they need for the problems that are presented, not just assigning them a disability and throwing them into the special education system. The United States has enacted policy before to assist people, but it's never gone without a fight. Every policy that has enacted meaningful change in minoritized groups in this country has not been given without fight and grit and organization. It's up to us as educators, the people closest to this problem, to fight for meaningful change in our classroom communities. We must be comfortable with uncomfortability. We must be willing to talk about these issues, and we must be willing to put our money where our mouth is and enact these policies and get this off the ground and realize that there is real systemic change that is harming actual, real children in our country. Thank you for your time and attention.